Okay. Thanks for being back. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our next speaker, Athena Akrami. Athena is a group leader at the UCL and the SWC. And today she's going to tell us about part of the work in her lab, which is about learning and controlling sensory statistics. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Francesca. Thanks all the organizers for this fantastic meeting, and I'm really grateful to be here. So today I'm going to talk about something which the concept is very familiar to a lot of you, but maybe not approach, which is a kind of a systems neuroscience approach in rodent, might not be as familiar, but I hope that you will find it interesting. So probably this doesn't work. Okay, so if you stare at this script, you realize that these are wrong, scrambled words, but at the same time you can read it. How come you can read it? Because you are relying on a long-term prior, which is learned language, in order to denoise these scrambled words, right? So the point is that the world around us is very complex, but it's at the same time full of structures that are meaningful and relevant to us. And we learn these structures all the time, either incidentally, like how we learned language in the first place, or with reinforcement. Like over several experiences and instances of eating fruit, we can learn the appropriate feel and touch, after which we can kind of categorize the fruit as ripe or unripe. So learning and exploiting such sensory statistics in the world is critical to make good decisions. Because once we discover these structures from the statistics in the environment, they become our priors, and then relying on these priors would hopefully help us to make better decisions. And this is also, so this is a fundamental property of the brain that can also be compromised in several psychiatric conditions. Our goal in my lab is to basically understand the mechanism by which neural circuits give rise to learning and exploiting sensory structures, a lot of the times in kind of implicit and unsupervised manner. So there are many theories and many studies in human cognitive science and theoretical neuroscience that talk about such learning, how we can learn and build priors and learn the structures. But it's difficult to draw a direct link between those theories and detailed circuit mechanisms because, unfortunately, data from animal research is scarce. So in the past few years, my lab has been trying to kind of address this gap by developing and studying controlled comparative paradigms in models, humans, rats, and mice. And we hope that like studying rats and mice is more tractable so we can approach the circuits easier. Particularly, we have this vision that there is a tight link between two components, two faculties of our cognition. On one hand, sensory events, they unfold and they happen over time. So we do need our working memory system in order to understand and learn the relationship between these sensory events. But on the other hand, our working memory system is inherently limited, has limited capacity. Therefore, it's kind of allocated to things that are more likely to happen. So they kind of influence each other, and all the projects in the lab are basically either related to one or the other, or the relationship between these two. And particularly, we study this kind of a statistical learning, either in feedback-based settings or in incidental settings. Today, I'm going to only talk about two basically studies. One is a simple sound categorization task and related to how we can kind of learn specific sensory statistics embedded in these sounds, and another is related to the working memory component. And when we talk about behavior and understanding such statistical learning behavior, we try to kind of understand it at different levels. The very first one is why such behavior is a good behavior, or why, given certain statistics in the environment, behavior should be this way or that way. And we approach it via kind of a looking at normative models, which is like there is an agent in this environment. What is the best behavior for this agent given the conditions, the statistical conditions in the environment? And another is that how such behavior can be achieved. And then for that, we basically look at either learning models or mechanistic models. So let's go back to the example of fruit. So this is an example of learned categorical behavior, where basically continuous and uncertain sensory information is used in order to make a categorical decision. And we would like to understand how statistics of sensory input can influence this categorical decision. For that, we, which means kind of a big team of people in the lab, they developed a comparative simple task in which humans, rats, or mice, they hear a sound at each trial, and at the end of the trial, they have to decide whether this sound belongs to category A, which means like below a boundary, and we are changing the amplitude of this sound, for instance. Doesn't matter, it can be different features. Or the sound has basically higher amplitude belonging to category B. And the boundary, I hope you do see my cursor again. Okay. So, and the boundary is somewhere in the middle of the amplitude range. Now, we are going to basically create different statistical contexts or priors by changing the way that we are sampling sound within each category. Today, I'm going to only focus on the condition that the probability of A or B is always fixed, 50-50. So the two categories are balanced, but we are changing how we are sampling the sound within each category. Sometimes one category is oversampled around the boundary compared to the other, okay? And the very first thing is that, okay, why should behavior be influenced by these stimulus statistics at all? And to do that, Ryan, who presented his work yesterday, more kind of a generic, actually, work he presented yesterday, he developed a normative model. In this normative model has different components. The generative part of this is normative model basically assumes that we know that sounds are drawn from a category, so he knows the kind of a probability of the two categories. We keep it balanced, and then knows the probability of a stimulus given category, and then this stimulus is mapped into some internal representation, which can represent the neural representation, is noisy, and then given this internal representation, the ideal Bayesian agent builds a posterior over the category and turns that into a decision given a certain loss function, and then this decision is such that it can maximize the reward in this task. And now we can basically manipulate this part of the generative model, the probability of a stimulus given category, the same way that we are manipulating the task, and see what should be the performance of the optimal agent. And you can see the performance, the prediction is that the psychometric curve of this optimal agent should systematically change based on the distribution, and in such a way that basically the category, which is oversampled around the boundary, should be favored. Okay? And that's basically because around the boundary, intuitively around the boundary, this internal representation, because it's noisy, would make the belief about the category more uncertain. And then given that uncertainty, it does make sense to favor that category. And we can show that rats, mice, and humans, they all change their behavior similar to this optimal agent. But then we can kind of have a more precise look at just asking how much each individual is optimal. And to do that, we need to have some kind of an estimate of this internal noise of each individual. And the cool thing is that with some assumption, we can basically estimate this noise distribution. And then the assumption is that each sound is mapped into some representation that can be kind of formalized by a Gaussian distribution, fixed mean, and the variance of this Gaussian can be either dependent on the sound amplitude or not, so the model can be flexible, and then we can estimate this noise distribution for individual subjects, and then based on that, we can predict what should be the psychometric given different manipulations in the statistics, and you can see that the empirical psychometric is kind of very close to the prediction of this optimal agent. And we can extract some parameters from these psychometrics, like the midpoint of the psychometric or the total reward rate, and compare the optimal agents to subjects. And you can see that for all species, they kind of follow the optimal agent. Okay, cool. So we have this behavior. It seems this species achieve this optimal behavior. Now the question is, how do they do that? The normative model at this point is not a learning model, because it just assumes that we do have this knowledge about different distributions. If we do have that knowledge and we use that, what should be the behavior? But now we are asking how that knowledge can be acquired, or how basically can, in these task agents, can learn and adapt. So from the kind of a theoretical perspective, there are different theories postulating different things about how such learning can happen. On one hand, some theories postulate a kind of a generative understanding of statistics. When agents learn the full model of the world, it's like a little monkey wants to kind of form a knowledge about what ripeness means, and it can both categorize a fruit as ripe or unripe, but can also imagine new fruits with the new kind of ripeness, because they do have this generative model, right? So they do basically learn the distribution of different categories completely. But on the other hand, some theories postulate that we don't need always to learn the full model of the world. We can basically just kind of build decision priors, meaning that we make actions, actions have outcomes. By integrating action and outcome, we can slowly adapt our behavior, and it's like basically only learning the boundary between the two categories. So the little monkey can categorize a fruit versus whether it is ripe or unripe, but that's it. It doesn't know the full knowledge of how stimulus within each category changes, and basically the full probability distribution. Okay, so inspired by this kind of a dominant theories about learning, we, Victor, adapted these two models, a model that only learns the category between the two the boundary between the two categories, and another model which learns the full distribution for each category. And so basically, the first one just like learns a map from stimulus to action. The second one learns a probability of stimulus given category. And once we know these, we can basically extract the boundary as well, right? So it's just a more complete model. When we fit the data, we realize that both of these models can explain the change in the psychometric behavior. Interesting, but boring and kind of troublesome, because we cannot differentiate them, it seems, right? Both of them achieve this marginal behavior of change in the psychometric. But the cool thing is that if we focus in how these models change their behavior trial after trial, then we can distinguish them, because they have a very different prediction when we basically how animals, after a certain sound in the previous trial, should change their behavior in the next trial. And when we fit individuals, we realize that most humans, they learn this full category, basically sensory priors, whereas some of them, they rely on just learning the boundary. Rats are somewhere in between, and mice mainly rely on the decision prior. So, and when we look at the kind of a learning curve, humans learn fastest than rats and mice. So that's very interesting. Okay, so now we would like to see, so what is the mechanism by which these animals basically would learn either of these two models. We don't have a mechanistic model yet. I'm going to basically present some teaser data from the rat and mice brain. So basically, we hypothesize that somewhere in the brain, the sensory and decision priors, either one of them or both of them, can be built based on the history of sensory and choices. And then down the line, they are going to impact this categorical behavior. So we are first trying to map different brain areas, candidate brain areas, onto this conceptual diagram, and then combining perturbation and circuit modelings, understand how they interact with each other. So, and particularly one part is related to the learning of the priors, and then another is just utilizing that prior. So, I'm going to just briefly mention one result from our rat electrophysiology, which is like looking at the anterior cingulate cortex in the rat. It seems that we can decode the two contexts, the two basically prior distributions, even before the trial starts. Whether in other brain areas that we have tried, like for instance, posterior thalamus, this distinction between the two distribution arrives much later. Okay, cool. So it seems this knowledge about this statistical context exists in ACC. But which part of this behavior basically relies on that knowledge? As I mentioned, we can think of it as just like kind of when a switch happens to a new context, it takes some time to learn that, this transition, and then the performance plateaus. We wanted to basically differentiate learning versus utilization, and in head-fixed mice, we used optogenetics to inactivate ACC, and particularly using such protocol that the animal is in a certain context, we make a switch to the new context. It takes some time before the basically psychometric shifts and plateaus, and then we introduce another switch. And we basically inactivate optogenetically during this phase, which is just during the utilization, and we want to see what happens. So here I'm showing, let's first focus on this switch from the blue to the red. So the switch happens here. You see that the midpoint of the psychometric starts to shift in the right direction. Then we start optogenetic inactivation, and you see that this midpoint kind of collapses back to where it was. And similarly to the switch from red to blue, it starts to go down, right, in the opposite direction. And then we inactivate, and it seems now that the midpoint is back to the baseline. So now they're as if like when we turned on the laser, which means inactivated ACC, the animal was no longer able to use that acquired knowledge about the context, and the behavior basically goes back to baseline. Okay, so in the rest of the talk, I would like to kind of focus on what happens during kind of a working memory if we want to incorporate some learned knowledge. And for that, I focus on some kind of old data by now on a delayed comparison task. So there is a stimulus, a delay, and a second stimulus, auditory or tactile. And then the animal should basically compare the second stimulus with the memory of the first one. And so usually in such working memory tasks, what happens, and it's been discovered more than 100 years ago, is that the working memory, it seems on average, drifts toward the mean of all sounds. So Hollingworth was trying like cards with different sizes, and what he realized is that just like human subjects systematically overestimate shortcuts, cards when they want to remember that card size in the memory, and underestimate long cards, as if like the memory kind of drifts toward the mean of the distribution of the all stimuli as seen in that task. So why? To look at the why, we can imagine that, okay, we present a stimulus, imagine a sound of a certain amplitude to the animal, and then after some time, the delay, after the working memory delay interval, we present a second sound, and we ask the animal to compare this second sound with the memory of the first sound. But the working memory is inherently noisy. So this memory of the first sound is far from a faithful representation. It's some noisy version of that. So brain, instead of giving up to this noise, is basically cheats in a smart way, meaning that it tries to remember the most typical sound, what is the most likely sound, and kind of use that in order to denoise this noisy representation. So people have been trying to basically kind of use a Bayesian framework for this contraction bias phenomenon that's just like working memory is noisy, we build a prior, what are the old stimuli in the task, and then use that prior in order to denoise the working memory representation. So the summary, I'm going to go through the results quickly. So if we present the first stimulus and the second stimulus, the diagonal is when they are the most similar. So it's very difficult to basically differentiate them. So the difficulty of the task is largest. So if we present a sound like this, under this assumption of contraction bias, the memory of the first stimulus would move toward the mean a vertical line, and by virtue of that, it gets closer to the diagonal. So it would make the difficulty of the task larger. But we do have some trials that under contraction bias, the memory moves toward the vertical, away from the diagonal, so comparison becomes easier. So we can kind of divide the stimulus set into these regions of bias plus, that contraction bias helps performance, and bias minus, where contraction bias hurts the performance. And these are the stimulus set that we use usually in these such tasks, and if we compare rats and humans, you do see that like there is this kind of a general phenomenon of contraction bias. Performance here is much better than here is worse than here for both animals. And we can also, on top of this contraction bias, which assumes that the memory drifts toward the average of all stimuli, there is another thing, another super strong phenomenon on these behaviors, which is this attractive effect toward the very most recent trial. So, and we can quantify that, and the summary is that we can just like use a proper regression model to really account for different these long-term mean bias or the short-term one trial back to trial back, and the result is that there is contraction bias toward the mean, it seems, but there is definitely very strong short-term serial bias, like in terms of the recency. So how can we basically make sense of these two? In rats, in the posterior parietal cortex of rats, if we inactivate posterior parietal cortex, we basically reduce both of these biases. So the contraction bias disappears, as well as the short-term history one trial back bias. And at the same time, if we do electrophysiology in posterior parietal cortex, neurons carry information about the most recent trials. So inspired by that, we wanted to basically build a mechanistic model. Vijay, who is in the audience, in collaboration with Claudia, she built a two-line attractor model. So it's one line attractor represents the working memory, and another line attractor represents the PPC or the history signal. They are similar but different in two ways. The history network basically has a slower integration time to account for this kind of the sensory history, and it also has some sort of adaptation. And we wanted to basically incorporate this fact that contraction bias and end-back trial sensory history biases are always together, and PPC inactivation doesn't impair the working memory behavior overall. It just like reduces the impact of these two biases. And what is happening in this network is that the working memory network, it always responds. So here, the y-axis is like the bump location in that line attractor. And the blue tick is just where the stimulus appears at each trial. You see the green, which is the working memory network, follows the stimulus. Right? It responds very quickly to the stimulus, and we expect this to just also then keep remembering that throughout the delay interval. The orange bump is the PPC, which moves very slowly because it's a slow integrator. And during the delay interval, what happens is that the working memory network is volatile and is receiving input from the PPC. But once the bump in the working memory network disappears, then it's basically, it goes wherever the input from PPC is. It just jumps to the memory coming from the PPC. So in this scenario, either during the working memory period, either the memory bump survives or it jumps to where PPC says. And by doing that, we basically, I'm going to skip over the results, but the description of the model, but we can both incorporate the serial biases, the one trial to trial back biases in the network, similar to our human and rat behavior, as well as the contraction bias. And the reason for that is basically, so here you see that the network is not explicitly learning any distribution. The network, the working memory network, just follows where the sensory history comes. And it's basically, what happens in the PPC network is that it's a point estimate that slowly changes over time. And without explicitly learning the distribution, when we look at the overall performance in the working memory network, we can recapitulate basically the contraction bias. And we have explicit prediction when, like for instance, we play with the stimulus distribution, how should the behavior be under like a vanilla version of Bayesian that like learns the full distribution, or this kind of an approximation of that Bayesian, which is like there is no explicit learning, it's just a point estimate of the past and then it moves around. And it seems that the human subjects follow our model better than the vanilla version of the Bayesian account of the contraction bias phenomenon. So in summary, it seems that working memory is impacted by sensory history, and there are two components in this bias, recency and contraction bias, that are presented in PPC. And it seems that if we just like have two networks that they are interacting with each other, but over different time scales, we can recapitulate the phenomenon of basically contraction bias into working memory behavior. So by that, I finish here, and I'm happy to get questions if there's any. Thank you.
I see an end over there.
Hi, thank you so much for the super cool talk. So I had a question about the discriminative versus generative representations. So is it possible to look at that through time and see if there's like a change in the, or a transition in the kind of strategy from like discriminative to like generative or vice versa? And then related to that, is it possible to like have like an alternative hypothesis, which is like a mixture of both? So you have like two different models and you're kind of relying on those models in different degrees, and can you kind of test that hypothesis as well?
Thank you so much for the question. So I cannot claim that we have a kind of a final answer to that, but that's exactly something that we are looking at. And we have looked at some of the rat data, particularly rats, some of the subjects, they start off generative, meaning that they really kind of care about the full stimulus statistics. And over time, as they realize that this is just a boring, repetitive task happening every day after, they just become discriminative, it seems. And that we are very interested in that. It seems it's so, but it's not for every subject. Some of them, they show that. But we need to look at that more carefully. In terms of whether a kind of a hybrid model would do a better job, maybe, but we haven't looked at that systematically, so I don't know. Yeah.
One very quick question. Peter?
So do you think that you could? Do you think that's not happening in your human subjects in this class of experiments?
So it might. I mean, it might. So the thing is that, again, remember that there is no real structure. We presented the trials randomly, right? So we are not putting any specific structure that need to be kind of discovered in this particular task, in this particular version of the task. Still, this kind of a contraction bias, it is optimal if the working memory becomes like, if you increase the working memory interval, it's definitely optimal. So it's like, estimating this kind of a overall distribution is useful. But I think the claim is that, so we would like to look at that more carefully, but just like whether this specific kind of a hacky way of remembering something, not the full distribution, only just like some past trials, is enough to approximate that optimal behavior.
So the rate distortion theory type.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
So let's thank Athena again.